In a vast, open field where the wind whispers secrets of the untamed, a young girl stood alone, her heart racing with excitement and fear. She had always been drawn to the wild, to the freedom that echoed through the tall grass and the distant mountains. But today was different. Today, she was about to witness something that would change her life forever. It started with a simple glance, just a fleeting moment, when her eyes locked with the stallion's. The wild creature stood at the edge of the clearing, his coat gleaming under the sun, his mane flowing like a river of fire. His eyes, fierce and knowing, seemed to hold the mysteries of the world. And in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. It was as if the world slowed, and in that moment they were not just girl and horse, they were two souls, connected by something far greater than understanding. The girl had spent countless hours in the meadows, watching the horses that roamed free, yet this one was different. He was untamed, wild in a way that the others weren't. He was the leader of the herd, strong, proud, and independent, with no interest in the human world. She had heard the stories how no one had ever been able to get close to him, how he had a reputation for being impossible to tame. He was a symbol of freedom, of wildness that could not be tamed or bridled. But as she stood there, frozen in the stillness of the moment, she felt something stir inside her. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, a pull, an undeniable connection. She could see the wildness in his eyes, yes, but she also saw something else. There was a deep loneliness there, something she recognized in herself. It was a sadness that no amount of freedom could erase. As the stallion took a step forward, the girl's heart skipped a beat. Should she run? Should she stay? The stories warned her to keep her distance, but something inside her told her to stay. It was a moment of truth, one that could change everything. But just as she took a tentative step toward him, the stallion hesitated, his ears flicking back. He knew she was there, but he didn't approach. Instead, he watched her closely, his gaze unreadable. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment of choice. Would he run? Would she back away? Or would something truly magical happen between them? The air felt thick with tension. Time seemed to stretch as they stood there, locked in a quiet standoff. Neither moved. Neither spoke. It was as though the world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, just as she felt she couldn't bear the silence any longer, the stallion took a step toward her. Not a galloping charge, not a defensive stance, but a slow, deliberate approach. Every muscle in his body was tense, alert, but there was something else, something unexpected. Trust. It was there, hidden behind the wild eyes and the raw power. He was willing to let her into his world. But how far would she dare to go? She reached out, her fingers trembling, unsure if she was ready for what might come next. Her heart raced, but she couldn't stop herself. The bond between them was growing stronger with every second that passed, and the only thing she could do was take one more step. Just as their fingers were about to touch, a sudden noise broke the spell, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. The stallion froze, his head whipping around. The girl's heart sank as the rest of the herd appeared, charging into the clearing. The wild stallion turned back to her one last time, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite understand. Then, in a flash, he was gone. The herd scattered, and the moment was over. She stood there, breathless, her fingers still reaching out for him, the weight of the connection they had shared lingering in the air. But now, she was alone. The wild stallion had returned to the wilderness, to the freedom that called to him, and she was left with nothing but the echo of that moment. But this wasn't the end. Not for the girl. And not for the stallion. What she didn't know yet was that their story was far from over. Their bond had just begun, and it would take her on a journey she never could have imagined. A journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about trust, freedom, and the power of connection. Would the stallion return? Would she have the courage to face the challenges ahead? Or would the wildness that defined them both ultimately pull them apart forever? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And so, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, the girl stood alone in the quiet meadow, waiting, wondering what the future held. The days that followed were filled with a strange emptiness. The girl could no longer spend her hours in the meadow without thinking of the stallion. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his wild eyes staring back at her, that moment of connection still burning in her memory. But no matter how hard she searched, he never appeared again. The field, once so familiar and comforting, felt like a place of longing now. Her family, of course, never understood. They thought she had simply imagined the encounter. Maybe it was just a moment of youthful fancy, they suggested. It's a wild stallion, they'd say, not a tame horse you can simply befriend. They had heard the stories too, the same ones everyone knew. About how no one had ever managed to capture the stallion, how he always stayed just out of reach, impossible to tame or train. Some even claimed that he was cursed, that anyone who tried to get too close to him would face bad luck. But she didn't believe in curses. She believed in something stronger, something she couldn't explain but felt deep inside her, a pull toward that stallion, a feeling that there was more to the story than the old legends suggested. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to change when he was near, in the way his eyes had seemed to see into her very soul. She thought about him all the time, and soon, the desire to see him again became all-consuming. She stopped playing with her friends, and her parents grew concerned about her distant mood. But none of it mattered. She was drawn to the wild, to the untamed places, and she couldn't let go of the feeling that she was meant to find him again. So each day, after finishing her chores and helping around the house, she slipped away from her family and spent hours wandering the fields, hoping that fate would lead her back to him. As the weeks passed, the wild stallion became a constant presence in her mind. Every rustle in the grass, every bird call, every shift in the wind made her wonder if he was near. It wasn't just about seeing him again. It was about understanding him, learning about the life he lived and the world he inhabited, a world that seemed so different from her own. The wilds, with their untamed beauty and raw freedom, were calling her, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. But there were obstacles. Her family's increasing concern was the least of them. There were others in the area who knew of the wild stallion, too. And not all of them saw him as a majestic creature to admire from afar. Some saw him as a prize to be captured, a horse to be tamed or sold for a hefty price. The girl had heard the talk in the nearby town, whispers about how some hunters were organizing a plan to trap the stallion, to break him in and claim him for themselves. It made her stomach churn. She couldn't let that happen. One afternoon, as she was walking along the edge of the meadow, deep in thought, she heard a commotion nearby. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it him? She followed the noise until she reached the edge of the forest, where she crouched behind a thicket and peered through the trees. There, in the clearing, was a group of men on horseback, their eyes scanning the area with the practiced sharpness of hunters. They were after him. Her breath caught in her throat. They didn't know he was so close, didn't know how near they were to finding him. She had to act fast. Without thinking, she dashed forward, her feet flying across the ground, dodging branches and bushes as she raced to the stallion's last known location. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved. She didn't know what she would do once she reached him, but she couldn't let these men capture him. Not after what had happened the last time. She didn't know how long she ran, but soon, the sounds of the men's voices began to fade. The air grew still, and a feeling of quiet surrounded her. Then, through the trees, she saw him. The wild stallion. He was standing in the middle of a small clearing, his coat shimmering like a ripple of light in the late afternoon sun. His mane danced in the wind, wild and free, his stance proud and regal. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for her next move. She felt the same pull, the same magnetic force that had drawn her to him before. But this time, there was no hesitation. She took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving his. He was watching her, his gaze intense and unreadable. Then, just as she reached out her hand, a loud crack echoed through the trees. The stallion's head jerked up, his eyes wide with alarm. She froze. It was the hunters. They had found them. The stallion bolted, his powerful legs carrying him effortlessly across the clearing and into the forest. She called out to him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the dense trees with the grace of a shadow. Her heart sank as she stood there, listening to the sounds of the men's pursuit. She couldn't let them catch him. She couldn't let them take him away. But she knew she couldn't keep running forever. Her only hope was to stay one step ahead of them. To keep him safe long enough for them both to find a way out. But what if there was no way out? What if the stallion was right? What if they were meant to be apart? The thought gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to think about it now. The stallion needed her. She had to protect him. She turned back toward the forest, her mind racing. She couldn't think of a plan, but she couldn't let the hunters win. She had to find a way to keep him free, to keep their connection alive. But time was running out. The next few days passed in a blur. She returned to the forest every day, searching for any sign of the stallion, but he was nowhere to be found. She spent hours in the same spot, hoping he would return, but each time she left empty-handed. The hunters were still searching for him, and the girl knew that if they found him first, there would be no chance of saving him. He would be captured, broken, and sold off to the highest bidder. She couldn't let that happen. But what could she do? The days grew colder as winter approached, and the girl's hope began to fade. She had stopped going to the meadow, stopped seeking the wild stallion. There were too many obstacles, too many dangers, and she couldn't protect him from them all. But one evening, as she sat alone by the fire, she heard a familiar sound outside her window, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like the beat of a drum. It was the sound of hooves. Her heart leapt into her throat. Could it be him? Without thinking, she rushed outside, her breath fogging the cold air. There, in the moonlight, was the stallion. He was standing just beyond the edge of the woods, his eyes shining with an intensity that made her heart race. But this time, there was something different about him. His coat was matted with mud, his body thin, and his movements slower, almost hesitant. He had been through something. She stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what to do. He was still wild, still untamed, but he had come to her. Why? What had happened? And more importantly, what could she do to help him now? She took a deep breath and slowly approached, her hand outstretched, waiting for him to decide. What would he do next? Would he trust her again? Or had the wildness of the world taken him beyond the reach of anyone, even her? She didn't know. But as she reached out to him, she knew one thing for certain: the story between them was far from over. And whatever happened next would change everything. The air was thick with tension as she took another step closer to the stallion, his presence so powerful that it seemed to fill the whole clearing. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, every instinct urging her to stay calm, to remain steady. The stallion's eyes, wild and knowing, met hers, and for the briefest of moments, she could see something else, a hint of desperation, as if he were asking her for something she couldn't quite understand. She stopped a few feet from him, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the same as before. His coat was patchy, his mane tangled, and he was limping slightly. It was as if the world had finally caught up with him, and the wildness he had once embodied was now starting to show its wear. She could feel it too, the weight of everything they had both been through, the distance they had traveled, the unspoken bond that had formed between them. But was it enough to save him now? Slowly, she extended her hand again, the same way she had done that day in the meadow. This time, however, the stallion didn't recoil. He stepped forward instead, his head low, his movements deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. She couldn't let the hunters get him. She couldn't let him slip away again. But just as she reached out to touch his nose, a sudden sound pierced the stillness of the night, a shout. It came from the direction of the town. The hunters. They were close. Too close. The stallion's head jerked up, his eyes wide with alarm. He was frightened, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability in him, the same vulnerability she had always felt but never let show. The realization hit her like a wave. The wild stallion was no longer just an untamable force of nature. He was a creature caught between two worlds, one of freedom, and the other of danger. Before she could react, the stallion bolted, his powerful legs carrying him into the night. She tried to follow, but her legs felt heavy, her body frozen in place as the sound of hooves faded into the distance. It was happening again. The wildness was taking him away. She had failed. But then, as she stood there in the cold, the unthinkable happened. From behind her, she heard a rustling sound. She spun around just in time to see a group of figures step out from the shadows, their faces half hidden by the darkness. It wasn't the hunters. They were locals, people from the town who had heard the stories, who had seen her wandering the fields, who had watched her grow obsessed with the stallion. They had followed her. "You're chasing a ghost," one of them said, his voice low and rough. "That horse is as wild as they come. You'll never tame him. You'll never keep him." She didn't know what to say. The words felt hollow in her mouth. She wanted to argue, to explain that she had felt it, that there was something between them, something real. But how could she convince them when she couldn't even convince herself? "We've been tracking him for weeks," another man spoke up. "And now we're here. You've had your chance. It's time for us to finish what we started." She looked back toward the direction the stallion had disappeared, her heart aching. He was gone, lost in the night. The hunters were closing in, and she was standing in the middle of it all, helpless. But just as she was about to turn and leave, her eyes caught something. In the distance, through the trees, a shadow moved. It was him. The stallion. But he wasn't running. He was standing still, waiting for her. Without thinking, she started to move toward him, ignoring the calls behind her. This was her last chance. She had to reach him. The stallion didn't run this time. He stood there, as if he knew she was coming for him, as if he had been waiting for her. She could feel the bond pulling her closer, stronger than ever. As she got closer, she realized something. There were no hunters. No traps. No plans to break him. The stallion wasn't being hunted. He had led her here on purpose. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. He had been waiting for her, not to save him, but to understand him. The stallion wasn't just a symbol of wildness. He was a creature trapped between two worlds, just like her, torn between the safety of the known and the danger of the unknown. And now, in that quiet moment, they stood together in the moonlight, their eyes locked in understanding. She didn't need to tame him. She didn't need to break him. What they needed was to live in the world they had both chosen, the one where freedom and connection coexisted. As the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, she reached out her hand once more. This time, he didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, and their fingers brushed against his mane. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise, one that neither of them could break. The wild stallion wasn't just a creature to be saved. He was her equal, her companion, and their bond had been forged in the quiet spaces between the world and the wild. But then, just as she felt the warmth of that connection, something shifted. The ground beneath her feet trembled, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. She looked up just in time to see something she never could have expected. From the trees, emerging like a phantom, came another figure, a man. Not a hunter, but someone far more dangerous. The leader of the hunters. He was grinning, a cruel smile that sent a chill down her spine. In his hand was a rope one she knew all too well. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" he sneered. "You've been playing with fire. And now it's time to put it out." Before she could react, the stallion bolted again, this time with a speed and power that left her breathless. He wasn't running from her. He was running from the man. From the danger that was real, that she hadn't seen coming. In that moment, she realized the true weight of the choice they both faced. They weren't just fighting for freedom. They were fighting for survival. And now, the world was closing in around them both. The question was no longer whether they could stay together, it was whether they could survive apart. As the stallion disappeared into the night once again, she stood frozen, the rope still in the hunter's hand, her heart in her throat. She had no answers, only the certainty that the wild stallion had taken her into a world where nothing was guaranteed and everything was at stake. The stallion disappeared into the trees like a shadow, moving with a grace and speed that left the world spinning. She stood there, frozen, as the man with the rope advanced toward her, his grin widening. Her heart raced as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. The wild stallion was gone, and now, the danger that had been lurking in the shadows had caught up to her. She couldn't let this happen. Not again. Without thinking, she turned on her heels and sprinted after the stallion, her legs pushing her harder than they had ever gone before. The man called after her, his voice mocking, but she didn't stop. She had to catch him. She had to stop them. She ran through the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, every branch, every root underfoot seeming to fight against her. But she couldn't slow down. She knew that if she did, the stallion would be lost forever. The woods were thick and dense, but somewhere ahead she saw the flicker of movement, him, the stallion, just ahead. He hadn't gone far. She caught up to him in a small clearing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, their eyes met once again. This time, there was no fear in his gaze. There was understanding, a quiet recognition that, in the end, they had both chosen this path, the path of freedom, of wildness. But it wasn't an easy path. It wasn't one that promised safety or guarantees. It was a path that required more than just courage, it required trust. And the stallion had trusted her, just as she had trusted him. The man's voice broke through the stillness of the moment, sharp and demanding. "You're wasting your time," he sneered. "You can't save him." But she wasn't listening to him anymore. She didn't need to. She was no longer just trying to protect the stallion. She was trying to protect something far more important, her own belief in the connection they shared. She couldn't let the world tear them apart, no matter how powerful it was. Not now. With a steady breath, she reached out, her hand trembling slightly. The stallion didn't move away. Instead, he took a step toward her, his eyes softening. For a moment, everything else faded away. It was just her and him in that clearing, two souls caught between two worlds. The man was closer now, his footsteps heavy, his presence imposing. He had a rope in his hand, but there was something in his eyes that showed he didn't truly believe in what he was doing. Maybe he had once thought capturing the wild stallion would be a victory, but now, as he watched the girl stand there with the horse, something in his expression shifted. There was doubt, a moment of uncertainty. And then, as if fate itself had made the decision, the stallion moved. He didn't bolt this time. He didn't run. Instead, he turned his head toward the man, his stance changing from one of fear to one of power. The air seemed to thrum with energy, as if the world was holding its breath. The stallion pawed at the ground, his body tense and ready to fight for his freedom. The man hesitated. It was the smallest of movements, but it was enough. Enough for the stallion to take the first step toward his freedom. And that was all it took. With a swift and powerful motion, the stallion reared, his hooves striking the air. The man took a step back, his eyes wide with shock. He wasn't prepared for this kind of fight. The girl, seeing the moment of opportunity, stepped forward. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. She had already said everything she needed to with her actions. She reached out for the stallion, touching his coat, feeling the warmth of his body, the strength beneath his muscles. She didn't need to tame him, to break him. She needed to be there for him, just as he had been there for her. And then, the stallion turned away from the man completely, his powerful body shifting into a graceful run. The girl watched as he disappeared into the night, disappearing deeper into the wild, the place where he belonged. The man stood still, his hands still outstretched, but it was clear that it was over. The stallion had made his choice. The girl stood there, her heart heavy but full, watching as the last glimpse of the stallion disappeared into the darkness. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she had found something precious in that wild creature, something more important than anything she had ever known. She had found trust. And with it, she had found herself. When she turned back to face the man, his expression had changed. The arrogant confidence that had once been there was gone, replaced by something else. Something like understanding. He didn't speak, but she could see it in his eyes. He knew, just as she did, that some things were meant to be wild. And no matter how hard anyone tried, they could never be truly tamed. The man finally dropped the rope, letting it fall to the ground at his feet. Without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the same forest that the stallion had fled into. She didn't need to watch him leave. She had already won. Days passed, and life slowly returned to a new sense of normal. The girl's family still didn't understand what had happened, how she had come to be so attached to the stallion, to the wildness that seemed to pulse through the air around him. But she didn't need them to understand. The bond she had shared with the stallion was something that couldn't be explained in simple terms. It was a connection that transcended everything else, a moment in time that had changed her forever. In the weeks that followed, she continued to visit the meadow. But now, when she stood there, she felt no emptiness. There was no longing for something she couldn't have. Instead, there was peace. The stallion had made his choice, and so had she. They had both found what they needed in the wilderness, in the untamed places where freedom and connection could exist together. And sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, she could swear she heard the sound of hooves in the distance, the soft rhythm of the wild stallion running free. It wasn't a promise that he would come back, but it was a reminder that some connections are never truly lost. They live on, like the wild, in the hearts of those who choose to believe. As she sat by the fire one evening, watching the flames flicker and dance, she realized that she had learned more from the wild stallion than she could have ever imagined. She had learned about trust, about freedom, about the power of connection that could never be broken, no matter the distance, no matter the obstacles. The stallion had given her something no one else could. He had shown her that sometimes, the greatest freedom comes from understanding when to let go. And with that realization, she smiled, knowing that she was no longer just a girl in the meadow. She was someone who had touched the wild, who had shared a moment of pure connection with something beyond human understanding. And that was something she would carry with her forever. The wild stallion was gone, but the story of what they had shared would remain, a quiet reminder of the bond between them, untamed and eternal.